Thank you, Hal. Good to see everybody this morning. If you will, turn with me to Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16. While you're turning, I heard a story about this older couple that was on a Sunday afternoon drive, and they were just kind of driving around the community like we used to do, and just passing the time, looking at the sights, talking with one another. And as they were driving along this road that they had not really traveled on that much, they saw a sign that was telling them about not only their direction, but what was coming up, and it said Nacogdoches 40 miles. And so they thought, well, that's kind of interesting, and it wasn't long until the conversation led into how you pronounce this town, and the wife had an opinion about how it was pronounced, and the husband had an opinion about how it was pronounced, and they talked back and forth for some time, and finally they said, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to be in town before long, and we'll just stop, and we'll ask them, how do you pronounce this town? How do you pronounce it? So they pull into the town, they get out at the first place they see, and they go in, and they say, listen, we're from another area of the state, and we saw your sign that was telling us how far we were from your town, and we'd like to know, if you would you say and pronounce very slowly and deliberately where we are? And so the young man that was behind the counter stopped for just a moment and thought, and then he leaned into him and said, Burger King. Today, we're going to look at one of the hardest parables that Jesus ever gave. We're in a series called Snapshots. Snapshots, for a lot of us old-timers, are those photos that we used to take and we can look at them. And Jesus painted a lot of word pictures of what the kingdom of heaven looked like and who was going to be in the kingdom and what they would be like. And this morning we're looking at a parable. The parable usually is called the Unrighteous Steward, and like I say, it is one of the toughest parables to interpret and to understand as Jesus tells us this parable. And we kind of have an understanding of why he spoke this parable in verse 14. In Luke chapter 16, verse 14, he said, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money and covetous, they were covetous people, were listening to all these things, and they were scoffing and mocking and ridiculing him. Now, this kind of tells me something that helps me to understand what Jesus is going to talk about, and that is that if I have material, worldly possessions, this parable is about me. Now, I'm not saying you're covetous, or I'm not saying that you are a lover of money, but what I am saying is we all have material possessions. And these material possessions, they're in different shapes, forms, sizes, quantities. And Jesus now kind of tells a catch-all parable that will help us figure out some things that are going to be very important for us in eternity. And so the question is really about the parable, because this man looks like a manager who swindles, or he cheats his master and he lies to him so that he can care for himself. As we read this parable, you're going to find that he's kind of feathering his own nest, and it looks like he has manipulated the books and took care of himself. And so it is a very hard parable to understand, but yet we see the motive of this is that anybody who has been given the stewardship of material things really needs to look at what is going on here, because if you have material things, this parable is for you. One day, I'm going to have to stand before God and give an account for the accounts that I have been given. And so, I had better account for my accounts wisely. Isn't that right? One day, I'm going to have to stand and give an account for the accounts that I have been given. And this parable has two simple lessons about what we think we own, what we think we have, what we think we possess. And the first of the lesson is, as we're going to read this, is that we are accountable for the management of what we have. We're accountable for this. Listen to what he says beginning in verse 1. Now, he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. And this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions, and he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. Now, what is he saying to us here? Well, you know what a manager is, don't you? A manager at Walmart, or a manager at Kroger, or a manager at any store. If you go, for instance, you may go to a clothing store, or you may go in some store, or retail store, and you say, I want to see the manager. And so they bring the manager out, and she or he is going to say, can I help you? Now, this manager more than likely does not own, possess, or have the goods that are in the store. They're not his. You go to Walmart and you say, I want to talk to the manager. They're going to bring out an individual that is the manager of the store, but these things do not belong to him, right? They don't belong to him. Okay, he is still held accountable for what is in the store. He is held accountable for the shoplifting. He's held accountable for the sales. He's held accountable for the inventory. He's held accountable by the way that customers are treated. He's held accountable for the employees and how happy they are. He's accountable for everything, but yet he doesn't own any of it. And this is kind of the interesting thing. Jesus said there was a fellow that was rich, and he had a lot of goods, and he had a manager, and this manager was not doing what he was supposed to do, and so he fires the manager. He calls him in and he says, what's this I hear about you, that you're not managing wisely? And really, the problem is not going to be so much that it was fraud as it was incompetence. He just wasn't doing his job as a manager. He was being incompetent. He wasn't stealing. He wasn't involved in fraud, but he just was incompetent. Well, that can kind of ring a bell on us, because you see, what I have, God has loaned, I do not own. You know that? The money I have, God has loaned. I don't own. The house I live in, God has loaned. I do not own. The car I drive, God has loaned. I do not own. The time that I have, God has loaned. I do not own. The bank account that I have, God has loaned. I do not own. And so we are the manager that's being talked about here, and he is saying, okay, this is the kind of manager that you don't want to get caught being, and that is an incompetent manager. When God gives us all of these blessings, you realize the blessings that we have here in America, and I love sometimes as we pray and we're conscious of the blessings, the freedoms, the things that we enjoy. Well, you know, coming with that is also the responsibility that one day I'm going to stand before God, and he's going to audit the books, and I'm going to have to give an account for the freedom that I had. You realize there are people in the world that don't have freedom to go to church, but yet I here in America have the freedom, but I choose not to come. You know, one day I stand and I give an account for that. There are people that do not enjoy the material blessings that I have, but one day I'm going to stand before God and I'm going to give an account for the blessings that he has given me. You see, there's another side to the coin that he's talking about. And so we must understand that we are accountable to the management of the things that we have. Everything we have is loaned. It is not owned. The manager he was the manager of everything, but he owned nothing. And the owner now fires this manager. And in firing the manager, he is going to audit the books. Generally, when there is a change in a company of management, what is the first thing they do? They hold inventory. And that's what he is going to do. He's going to run an inventory of what is there, what's not there, what should be there. And this man is going to have to give an account for this. And Jesus applies that to you and me and our life. Do you realize that Jesus said every idle word that we say, we're going to give an account of it one day? He says that every thought we have, yeah, that includes the thought of getting angry at somebody, or being jealous of someone, or idolizing something and placing it above God. I'm going to give an account for it. As a matter of fact, Paul says in Romans 14 in verse 12 that someday every one of us are going to stand before God, and we're going to give an account for the actions that we have done in the flesh. The books are going to be open if you look at the book of Revelation, and there is going to be an auditing, but God audits the book every day, as we're going to see, and one day we're going to give a final tallying of what's going on. Now, in verse 3, there is a response. The manager said to himself, now he's thinking out loud here. He says, what shall I do? I'm fired. I've got to do something. He said, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I've been incompetent, and he's taking it. He's going to give it to someone else. And notice that he said, I'm not strong enough to dig, but I'm ashamed to beg. Now, he is in a rock and a hard place, isn't he? He said, I'm too proud to beg, but I'm not strong enough to dig. I've got to do something for my future. And I know what I shall do in verse 4. So when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. Now, you see, he says, what can I do to prepare a future after this job? Now, the owner has already sent word, I'm firing you. I'm going to hold you responsible, and we're going to give an accounting. We're going to do inventory. And then you're going to be out. And this man says, okay, well, what can I do since I'm going to be in a position of unemployed, that I can have people who are friendly to me, that they will welcome me into their homes? How can I prepare myself a future? What am I going to do with what I have today so that I can be ready for the future that's coming? That leads now to the second lesson. You see, we are accountable for our accounts to the management of our accounts, but we are responsible to the master for what we have. Let's read verses 4 through 7. I know what I shall do. So when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. So he said to him, take your bill and write 80. And the master praised him. Let's stop right here for just a moment, because we don't want to get too far into this. But I want you to notice what is going to take place here. Now, as he brings these debtors in, he's asking each one of them, okay, what do you owe? Because just like in any kind of business, you've got people who have outstanding debts. Okay, what is the debt that you owe? What is the debt you owe? What is the debt you owe? Okay, he's trying to straighten these things out so that these people will welcome him into their homes, because the owner has said, you're out, you're fired. And so the first one that he talks to is a man who owes for oil. Another one is a man who owes for wheat. Now let's look at these for just a moment, because they help us understand what's really going on here. 100, he says, now what do you owe? And he says, well, I owe 100 measures of oil. 100 measures of oil is about 800 gallons of oil. And at that day's prices, it would have taken 3 years of wages to have paid that debt. So we're talking a pretty good debt. Now, another one is asked, well, how much do you owe? And he says, well, I owe 100 measures of wheat. And so he says, well, you owe an equivalent to 1,100 bushels of wheat. That's what 100 measures of wheat would be. 1,100 bushels of wheat. 1,100 bushels of wheat would feed 150 people for an entire year. And at the average wage, we're talking about a debt that would take the average person of that day 7.5 years to pay off. Now, here comes the thing that is the kicker in this, and that is, these are debts that are occurring interest. What were the interest rates? Because here is what Jesus is talking about. When it came to the debt of oil, he owes for 800 gallons of oil. You know what the interest rate of oil was? 100%. 100%. You know what the interest rate for wheat was? 25%. 25%. So what is he doing? Basically, whenever he goes to the fellow who owes the oil, he is telling him, cut it in half. In verse 6, he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill and sit down and quickly write 50. He's cutting it in half. The man that had the wheat, he says, how much do you owe? Well, I owe 100 measures of wheat. That's 1,100 bushel of wheat. Takes 7.5 years to pay it off. He says, well, sit down and write 80. He basically is turning an interest-incurring debt into an interest-free debt. You see, he cut the 100% interest off the 100 measures of oil, made it 50. He cut 20 of the wheat off to make it of the 25% that he owed somewhere in that area there, to where he now has an interest-free debt. Now, what does that really have to do with anything? Well, we'll look at it this way. What if somebody came to you and said, you know, I know you have a mortgage on your home, yeah? Okay, that mortgage, what, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is, yeah? What percentage is that? Well, it may run 6% or 5% or 4% or whatever it is, and that doesn't seem like a lot, but over 30 years, it's a pretty good bit, isn't it? If you ever look at the breakdown of your mortgage, you'll see that on the front end of your mortgage, you pay hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in interest and just a little bit in principal. And what if the mortgage company sent someone out there to your house and says, we're going to take that old mortgage, we're going to tear it up, and we're going to give you an interest-free mortgage? That would cut what you're actually paying by almost 2/3. You take a $100,000 house, you prorate it over 30 years, you pay almost $300,000 for that $100,000 house because of all this interest that you've got to pay. Well, what if he comes along and he says, I'm going to cut that, and you don't owe but just the principal. Every time you write a check, you're just paying principal. You're not paying interest at all. Would that person become a buddy? Would he be on your Christmas card list? I guarantee you that'd be a best buddy. You see what this man is doing? Pretty shrewd, isn't he? He is going to these people and he is saying to them, I want you, okay, what do you owe? 100 measures. Okay, depending on what the product was, the going interest rate, he says, okay, cut the interest. We're going to look at this as an interest-free loan. An interest-free loan. So now, notice that he tells them, and it's interesting, in verse 6, he said concerning the measures of oil, he told him, he says, take your bill and sit down quickly, and you write 50. He tells the one who owed the 100 measures of wheat, he says to take your bill and write 80. Notice that he does not reduce the debts on paper. He allows them to do that. He transfers this from an interest-paying loan to an interest-free loan. And he says that I want you to make this. And there's a reason why he was so shrewd at doing what he was doing. Now, the person who owed for the oil and the person who owed for the wheat, whenever he is given this opportunity, what is his assumption? That the master says it's okay for me to do this. Okay, so I'm going to enter into an interest-free loan. A second thing is that when the master sees this account, and it is not in his manager's handwriting, but it is in the handwriting of the debtors, he's stuck. He can't go back and tell him, no, it's not going to work that way. You're going to have to pay the interest. And so he now has, through his shrewdness, used an opportunity to feather and prepare a future for himself. Now look in verse 8. And his master praised him, praised the unrighteous manager or the incompetent manager, because he had acted shrewdly. You know what he said? I got to hand it to you. I don't approve of what you've done, but that was one slick move on your part. You see, what has he done? He has placed the master, the man who owned all this stuff and all these debtors. How do the debtors now view the master? Remember that old skin flint that used to charge us 100% for oil? He gave me an interest-free loan. I want to thank him for doing that. You know, we're buying wheat from him. He's charging us 25% for it, and I owe 7.5 years of wages. He came along, and he gave me an interest-free loan. Now, I've cut it down. I don't owe but for 3 years. You see, he's stuck. He can't go back and change it. And he tells this manager, you are very, very shrewd in what you have done. Now, Jesus is going to make a lesson in verse 9. And he says, and I say to you, he's talking to the disciples after saying this. Back up in verse 8, the master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. And then notice that he says, for the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. And then in verse 10, he says, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is righteous or unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful to the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? Now, what is he saying here? Well, let me give you some questions that'll kind of help you to understand what Jesus is saying. Do I understand that all that I have has been loaned and not owned? No matter what I have, God has loaned this to me. Do I understand that? Number two, do I have more passion about what I can get rather than what I can give? Isn't that the point Jesus is making? It's not about the getting. It's about the giving that Jesus says. And then number four, will there be people who will welcome me into heaven because of how I have used what God gave me on earth? You ever thought about that? Your time, your compassion, your money, your house, your car. Are the people going to welcome me into heaven because, you know, you did this for me? You took what God gave you and you used it, and I ended up in heaven, and I want to welcome you into heaven as well. See, that's what Jesus is talking about. And then the last one, does the way I handle earthly riches and possessions prove that God can trust me with eternal riches and possessions? If you notice, what did he say? Now, he's talking about money and goods, and he says, he who is faithful in what? In little things. Isn't that interesting? He called money a little thing. He called possessions a little thing. He said, how I handle little things is going to determine what God puts me in charge of bigger things, eternal things. Now, you know, this morning, that parable now begins to make sense, doesn't it? That Jesus is saying, what you have you don't own, it's loaned. What you do with it is going to determine where you go, heaven or hell. And that you're a manager. You can be a good manager or a bad manager. It's up to us. Either way, we want to do this. And Jesus said this, why? Because of verse 14, that the Pharisees who were lovers of money and possessions were listening to what he said, and they were scoffing and they were ridiculing him. You see, they weighed up in materialism and worldliness. And that's one thing that our culture is very hard on Christians about, is materialism and, you know, got to have this, got to do that, got to spend for this. It's all about me. It's about my way. And Jesus says, no, actually all these things, they're little things. Maybe this morning, your life is a lot. I'm closing out. is a lot like Mary as she approached the tomb on that resurrection first day of the week. And when she got there, the stone that weighed thousands of pounds had been rolled away, and there's nothing there but this big, gaping black hole. And her life, and she felt like, you know, this movement of Jesus and his ministry and his kingdom, she felt like it was just as dead and heavy as that lifeless body that she had helped place in there on Friday. As a matter of fact, that even when she got there and saw that the body was gone, she didn't say, "Oh, great, he's resurrected." What did she say? Somebody stole him. She even said there was a gardener there, and she asked him, "Where have they placed his body?" You see, Jesus, his resurrection, we can resurrect our lives. And in resurrecting our life and ourself, our relationship with others, our marriage, our relationship with our children, those things right there, we can, right now they may feel just as lifeless and heavy as that dead body. But resurrection can come, and we can experience it. But it's a choice that we have to make. This morning, what are you doing with what God has given you? That's the key right there. What am I doing with it? Those little things. This morning, if you need to put your Lord on in baptism, I want to encourage you to do that. Won't you come as we stand and sing?